Welcome all to the good afternoon to the Keynote lecture. Today, Keynote lecture is entitled "The Politics of Memory and Commemoration," and the Keynote speakers are Bernhard, who is a professor of political science at the University of Florida. He studied the role of civil society in democratization, institutional choice in new democracies, political economies, and the legacy of extreme form of dictatorship. Welcome also to the second keynote speaker, Professor Kubik, who is professor in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and has been appointed director of the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University College of London. Both Professor Bernhard and Professor Kubik are co-editors of an important work, the volume 20 Years After Communism, The Politics of Memory and Commemoration. So I give you the first to speak is Professor Kubik. Okay. I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this kind invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. This is like bringing the baby home and proudly show it to the family, because the project in many ways started here in Warsaw, and the kind of if Michael is the father, I'm the mother, or the other way around, I don't know. We have a few uncles and aunts here in Warsaw. One actually aunt, very important, Professor Kurczewska, cannot be here, and Professor Szacka is here, or was here, and she is another aunt of the project. She listened to me already, I guess, twice, talking about it. And one of the uncles is here, Professor Krzemiński. So, we brought the baby to proudly present it. Then I hope, you are not going to be too critical. It's hard to be critical of beautiful babies, right? And of course, as parents, we are very attached to our baby. Okay, let me start. So, I am not going to be telling you a lot about the history of the project because we have no time. And I already lost the connection now. We will tell you what's in the book, and of course, if you have questions about some more specific issues, we will address them during discussion. The project is a collaborative study of the 20th anniversary of the fall of communism in 17 post-communist countries, including 15 new democracies, Germany. Well, Germany is not a new democracy in the sense that the others are, and Ukraine as a sort of a test case of a, to put it mildly, flawed democracy, but nonetheless still a somewhat democratic political field. It was very important for us you will see, for us to look at democracies. That's the main reason that Russia is not in the sample, because we realized early on in the project that the whole theoretical framework would have to be somewhat retooled to deal with Russia. We have a whole bunch of sort of mottos that guided us. My favorite is from Joseph Stalin. The production of souls is more important than the production of tanks. And therefore, I raise my glass to you writers, the engineers of the human soul, one of his most famous quotes. Another quote that guided us is, I'm an anthropologist, I'd have to have something like that, I suppose. A Hopi proverb, the one who tells the stories rules the world. On the other hand, the project started in a very mundane way, I think over a beer with Michael and a few friends about 5 years ago. We discussed why Poland had such a bizarre and complex set of ceremonies on the 20th anniversary of the fall of communism. So if you recall, you had the whole bunch of various events throughout the country, from Kraków to Gdańsk, of course several in Warsaw, there were two things to celebrate. One was the round table, and the other were the elections. You all recognize the actors. You would look at it a bit closer, then you would realize that they are all in different places at roughly in the space of in some cases, of the same day even. So what you had was about 5 interpretations of the round table, which we describe in some detail in the book. We also co-authored the chapter on Poland. And there were 5 in June, so to celebrate the elections of 1989, there were 5 major separate celebrations. So all of this, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, happens in the context of the very deep cultural and political polarization among what clearly we can call the post-anti-communist elites, right? By then, as in a few other post-communist countries, the ex-communists disappeared from the political scene, usually collapsing under the weight of their own corruption, and various strategic errors of admitting, for example, that they screwed up, which they did in Hungary just in 2006, and which is a very important part of the Hungarian story. And in this polarization, you have 2 ex-Solidarity parties or political cultural formations, and you have a presence of at least one aggressive actor of a specific kind, which we then already from the beginning called a mnemonic warrior. And that's peace. Of course, it is possible to interpret certain actions of PO, the other actor, also as somewhat similar to the stance of the warrior, but an observation from a bit of a distance shows that law and order party is way more aggressive. So then we thought, well, how typical is this model, right? And that is the beginning of the comparative project. The first country we looked at was, one of the first, was the Czech Republic. Perhaps because my great-grandmother was Czech, I don't know. I agree with me that that's the main reason. But, of course, we wanted to look at the Czech Republic, very important case. What we noticed then in the Czech Republic, that the celebrations had a very different tenor. They were organized in a very different way. The state stayed sort of away from the celebrations. Václav Klaus, right before the celebrations, managed to offend the public, which he had a special knack for doing in his career as the president. He called the Czech people the sheep. He meant that, they are very opportunistic. They're like sheep, and they always look for greener pastures somewhere. They're never happy or something like that. The celebrations were organized by 2 organizations of students, so typical organizations of civil society, and they came to Václavský náměstí dressed as sheep, as you can see. And that's one of the main events of the celebration of the 20th fall of communism. Such events organized by those organizations took place in several other cities throughout the Czech Republic. One of the elements very important in the celebration was this gift to the president from the student, and it's simply a pile of shit. Which was their interpretation of what happened in the last 20 years, that a lot of shit happened, obviously they thought, and this is what they were presenting to the president. Now, that means, of course, that the celebrations have a very strong element of what we call social criticism. And it was not just about the memory of the fall of communism, not just about the memory of communism, but also about the intervening 20 years. So the main organizers were Opona in Inventura Democrație. They were talking a lot about returning to the ideals of Havelian philosophy, the power of the powerless, to the spirit of the Velvet Revolution. It was very full of irony, carnivalesque reversals. 1968 was way less pronounced than 56 in Hungary. Those are 2 dates, of course, of the Soviet invasions of those countries. So that gives, Hungarians, as you will see in a moment, cannot even start. The moment they start thinking about the past, 56 is like 56. And in 68 somehow was not emphasized to the same degree, if at all, in the Czech celebrations. There were also recreations of everyday shortages of state socialism, so there was a lot of kind of playful game with memory, but overlaid with the heavy dose of social criticism, and most importantly for us, not organized by civil society, by the state, but the civil society organizations. I'm checking my time. I may need to accelerate a bit. I should stop around 20 minutes, so Michael can present to you the analysis. Hungary. Hungary, as I said, is really heavily invested in terms of this country's memory to remembering the revolution. So you have the picture of it. One of the symbols of the revolution in 1956 was the Hungarian flag, which you may recall had a sickle and a hammer in it. They cut it out, and the flag with the hole in it became very symbolic, very important for them. On June 27th, this famous moment where the Iron Curtain is cut, and this is this moment where soon afterwards East Germans in thousands are beginning to stream into Austria through roughly around this area, around Sopron in Hungary. One of the events related to the opening of the Iron Curtain was what was then already known as the European Picnic. Later, a memorial was built on the spot, close to the spot where it was all happening in Sopron in Hungary. The flag returned in the celebrations in 2009, as did the I cut out the slide, sorry. The second, I'm shortening the story. As did the some form of criticism, as in the Czech Republic, but this time very heavily politicized. This is in 2009. 2009 comes 3 years after 2006, which was, we use heavily this concept of mnemonic calendar, or the tyranny of the mnemonic calendar. The term was coined by my colleague and friend at Rutgers, Aviator Zerubbabel. 50 years. You have to celebrate. Obviously, everybody wanted to. So in 2006, there were celebrations in Hungary. You may remember something about it. But it was already, Orban and his party were already on the right, because, you may recall that they used to be sometime in the earlier future, post-communist, on the left. By then, they traveled all the way to the right. And they were establishing the powerful political punch from the right to the whole system, which lasts until today. And that's, of course, their poster. What you need to do is to sweep away the red rubbish out of the country. And red rubbish was everybody who was to the left of them, since they were on the extreme right, and everybody was rubbish, I guess, in a sense. But at the same time, the Social Democrats committed at this very moment in 2006 political suicide. Prime Minister Gruciani announced that during the campaign they were lying. They literally said that. I mean, he said it in a closed meeting, but it was one of the closed meetings, like the famous Khrushchev speech denouncing Stalin, which was, as we remember, was supposed to be for the closed audience. And the next day, everybody in Hungary knew that the leader of the leading party, ex-communist, now Social Democratic Party, told the audience that they were lying in order to win the elections, lying about the state of public finances. This is the end of social democracy in Hungary until now. Right? No viable left is left, because the existing left committed political suicide. So that's roughly the Hungarian situation. So but still in 2009 they were kind of limping. They were organizing those celebrations, but without much convictions. The much more powerful, visually, ritualistically presence was the presence of the right. The picnic was an important thing, deep shadow of 1956, and as I said, increasingly pronounced cleavage between the left and right. Somewhat similar to Poland, but different kind of bit colors of specific Hungarian context. Latvia, I will not go through all 17 countries, no way, and I really need to accelerate. Latvia celebrated the famous human chain. I was just, a month ago at the major celebration of this event where I also was giving a talk similar to this. This is for Latvians a formative memory, and this is absolutely formidable, right? It is not just Latvia, it is all three countries there. I've spent enough time in those countries to try to avoid saying Baltic states, because Latvians and Lithuanians and Estonians do not particularly like being clustered too much. But this is absolutely extraordinary. I wish I had more time, if you don't know about this event, to describe it a little bit more, but eventually it becomes the object of memory, as were the barricades in Riga, where the parliament was actually debating secession in practical terms from the Soviet Union. This is the celebration in 2009, different kind of type of celebration. The basic event was a run, just a few miles, but all major politicians participated in it together. What is this all about, right? After just a few quick examples. Some of those things you know very well, obviously. Just let me quickly repeat that we tend to remember collectively and selectively. And when you put those two things together, then you get a very volatile mix, right? We often, if not always, remember this way. And the way we remember is, in a very important way, shaped by the various types of contexts of that memory. So in those contexts, we particularly focus on the political context, and we say that narratives about the past can and will be constructed according to the political interest of storytellers. It is an extreme assumption, close, kind of pushing us almost to the edge of a rational choice, game theoretical view of politics. We want to start there, and then we quickly learn that those assumptions are too strong, as I will try to demonstrate in the next 6 minutes. So the actors of memory politics matter. That's the very important statement that we rely on. Contest over the shape of collective memory, this is our main credo in the sense. Related to this engineering of human souls Stalin talked about, are the center of politics, because they are at the heart of two central issues for any political community: construction of collective identity and the legitimacy of power. This particularly, we talk a lot about the first one. We want to focus a little bit more on the second one. And the nation is arguably the most political of all forms of collective identity, right? I guess we all would agree. Then we have the quote that we really love from Leszek Kołakowski, a great Polish philosopher. This is a motto of our book. I will, if you want, I will return to that, but I have to skip it very quickly because I want to stay within time. Basically, Kołakowski tells us that selectivity and collectivity, those two features that we singled out for our attention, are at the center of constructing memory. And selectivity means that we officials not only help or force people to remember something, but they are equally active in pushing people toward forgetting. So this selectivity is very important. And the nation is a construction out of the tissue of memories. Now, we have no doubt, let me just jump ahead a little bit, we debated it a lot, the memories are constructed at perhaps dozens of different levels, from individual through small collectives like families, to neighborhoods, to organizations of civil society, all the way up to governments. We know that. The memory of '89 is constructed all those levels. That's the topic of this conference. I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more about the side of building memory that we deliberately, I swear deliberately, it wasn't a mistake, deliberately put aside. We only want to look at what we are calling official memory, which is the memory constructed, you will see what we mean by that. We are political scientists and we're comparativists. So we unfortunately are in business of simplifying, or fortunately, depending on one's position on simplifying and comparing. Anyway, we can talk about methodology later. We came up with the idea that there are basically three types of, two objects that we're particularly interested in, which is mnemonic or memory actors and memory regimes that emerge as the result of actors' interactions. Then we have four types of actors. An actor can be an individual, party, organization. Mnemonic warriors, mnemonic pluralists, mnemonic abnegators, and mnemonic perspectives. Mnemonic perspectives are those who say, we don't care about the past, let's look into the future. Quite importantly, obviously, in the history of the world, the last, 200, 150 years, the mnemonic perspectives were people of the left. Particularly communists, and they were always telling us that the legitimizing device is the future, not the past. Mnemonic warriors say, we have the truth about the past, and that's it. If you don't share that, then get lost, or we have no time to discuss much with you. Mnemonic pluralists, in one way or another, say, yeah, we have our own version of history, you may have your own. Let's sit down and try to figure out if we can come to terms, to an agreement over some, at least, subset of those memories, which we will call mnemonic fundamentals. And then we will differ on something else. Mnemonic abnegators are the people of the present. There are more important issues in politics, they say, than issues of memory, and therefore we abstain. We abnegate. If you put it all together, you can end up, we thought, with three types of memory regimes. If you have at least one memory warrior in the mix, you get a fractured memory regime. If you have no warrior and at least one pluralist, you get a pillarized memory regime. The concept of pillarization we take from Leibhardt, his famous analysis of Dutch or Belgian, or later extended to India, Israel, politics, right? Perhaps you're familiar with it. We apply this concept to the field of memory. And then unified field is no warrior, no pluralist. The situation is everybody has one version of the past, which basically, by definition, we feel is impossible in democracy. But, we all are studying, some of us, what was happening in this part of the world before '89, and enormous amount of resources was expanded in the Soviet Empire on creating a unified field of memory, particularly official field of memory. Of course, unofficial narratives were constantly popping up and kind of destroying this attempt. But if any part of the world got close to this kind of unified field of memory, that's perhaps when it happened, right? So three types of memory regimes. Mnemonic regime, there's a few more remarks about the conceptual apparatus. Mnemonic regime is constructed around a specific event, process, personage. For example, the fall of communism. So what we are proposing, this is really important, as a methodological device, we are proposing that you have two very importantly different concepts. Mnemonic regime, built around something specific, event or something like that, and the mnemonic field, which is simply a collection of discrete, to some degree, at least for the sake of analysis, memory regimes. So a set of memory regimes in a given country and period constitutes national memory field. And then another thing that we realized during our analysis, a given political actor can engage in a given memory regime as a warrior, abnegator, or pluralist, right? And can take a completely different choice. So let's say in regime memory A, I will decide I'll play as a warrior. Then there's regime memory B, and I say I don't go there. So I will abnegate. That allows us to observe various political actors, how they engage or disengage from various issues, or as we call it, various memory regimes. Some of them are, of course, very consistent. And they enter almost every memory regime that's around as a warrior. Some are consistent the other way. And finally, what is important, we're interested only in a subset of all of this, which we call the official memory regime, set of memory regimes. That means an official subset of the field of memory. And official memory regimes are produced, as we define it, by governments and political parties. And they constantly clash with other memory regimes produced by other actors and in other sort of parts of the social field. I'm almost there, like 2 more minutes, and Michael will take over. There's a whole section in our theoretical chapter about explanation. So why on earth you would have the event roughly looking the same, the fall of the communist regime in 1989 in 17 countries, and it looks so different. You know, there's difference between Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, how to deal with it, right? So we go into, you know, what we've both been working on a little bit, some kind of theory of culture, cultural explanation, which is something I'm very interested in. In a almost silly, because of its simplicity way, I have to present it in, say, 1 minute. This takes us to the debate that was already started by the first keynote, which is the tension between structure and agency on the one hand, and then the second tension is between political and cultural calculations, or political and cultural dimensions. If you take those two together, you get 2 by 2. I am the student in Krakow. I studied sociology in Krakow. My professor was Piotr Stompka. Some of you may know his works. Stompka always worked with 2 by 2s, so I am genetically damaged. I work with 2 by 2 step 2. And so this is, and Michael was kind enough to go ahead because he is a good comparativist. He knows that we need to simplify. So basically what we have in this 2 by 2 is political constraints, political choices, cultural constraints, and cultural choices. And what we're explaining, so now after 4 sets of things, right, we single one of them as something to be explained, right? So this is our why, if you are more statistically minded. This is something that is our dependent variable. And then we have 3 groups of independent variables. Now, the values of the dependent variable of political choices are 3. You get fractured, pillarized, or unified political regime, and then you have a bunch of factors which help us explain, and okay, you cannot see that, so I have to tell you what's there, how and why, in some sense, you get a specific memory regime, right? Again, 17 countries, we observed this in 17 countries through very detailed studies of the best country experts we could find, and then very carefully we're coding all of this, and we're sort of summarizing the information that we have in 17 cases into something way simpler that Michael will describe in the moment. I will just give you an example of 2 or 3 independent variables. You know, this is something that is a stuff of methodological seminars, particularly with advanced students. How do you choose your explanatory factors, right? And there's no answer to this question. It is often your gut feeling. It is your overall expertise over many years of working on something that you will say, I think that those will need to go to my explanatory scheme versus something else. Of course, in an extremely ambitious situation where you would have to spend years on this, you would consider all of them. But nobody has resources. Everybody has advanced from whatever doctor to docent to whatever. So they always work with smaller sets of factors based on something that is your gut feeling. So this is a bit about our gut feeling, but perhaps you will all agree that what is really interesting, if you want to explain this variance in 17 cases of memory regimes concerning how they remember the fall of communism, is the nature of the communist system in the given country, right? And there's, of course, we both are political scientists, we work on this. There are many ways to come up with the typology of actually existing socialisms. But the simplest one, and you will see in a moment why we're looking for a simple binary coding, the method we used demanded that, we just coded them reformed and hardline, which is a respectable way of thinking about state socialism. There were basically 3 countries in our set of 17 that were reformed: Slovenia, Poland, and Hungary. And nobody who knows the region and works seriously on it would basically debate that, and in all other countries, the system was harsher, particularly after 56, in the 60s and the 70s. So that's one. Another variable that we looked at, and we actually used it, we called it, we debated it forever, is it a cultural constraint or cultural choice? Eventually we decided it is a choice, which is the choice of identity by ex-communist parties. Ex-communist parties basically had 4 choices after the fall of communism. They could remain communist, very few did. They became social democrats, they became nationalists, or they became statists. The old good tradition of Central Europe, in particular in Latin America, that you are a party of no specific ideology. It is what the Russians these days call the party of power. And then, we combine the nationalists and the party of power, because if anything, if ever they think about any ideology as the party of power, it is usually some form of nationalism. So we ended up with the variable called the new identity of the ex-communist party with 3 values, right? Social democrat, nationalist, or communist. Very few of them. So that now you have, I hope, the sense of the variables. Michael will talk a little bit more about them. Remember, what we want to explain is why and how in a given country you have a specific type of the memory regime, and the types are 3. Thank you.
Yeah, you need to advance that. Or you can give it to me. So I think it's important to mention that Jan and I put the project together, but we had, over a dozen collaborators who wrote individual chapters. And in some sense, though their names aren't on the cover, they are our co-authors of this, and they worked interactively with us in terms of helping us to refine the theory. And for instance, when we were talking about what the possible independent variables were, it worked through discussions with these people as to what was most salient, what was most important in order to understand the outcomes of cases. And here you have the kind of initial, this is a pointer here?
Yeah.
So here you have the most important variables we did in our analysis. Jan already talked about type of state socialism. We also talked about the mode of extrication from state socialism.
Mike. Hold it. Mike, think about Mike.
We also talked about the mode of extrication from state socialism, whether that was through regime collapse, negotiation, or elite control from the top, as being 3 different modes. We talked about whether there was a polarizing cleavage at the time of the commemoration, whether that polarizing cleavage was ethnic, political, or overlapping. The nature of the first communist, communist successor party. Then the concept of memory layering, which is something that we think is relatively new and was very important in explaining many of the outcomes. That is, that there was more than one recollection focused on that moment of time that came in and impeded on the way that the other event was remembered. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then, of course, the key decisive variable for whether the regime becomes fractured, unified, or pillarized is whether a mnemonic warrior emerges. And indeed, that's what we will solve for when we show you how we did our analysis. So social science rears its ugly head. In this case, it's not statistical. It is, however, Boolean analysis, quantitative comparative analysis. And this is the analysis we did for the emergence of mnemonic warriors. This is an intermediate level Boolean analysis, and where we looked where there were invariant kinds of patterns across groups of cases, and then we referred back to the narratives to kind of come up with a coherent causal story on how these factors kind of adhered together in various cases. This is our Boolean truth table for the emergence of memory warriors. All this coding, by the way, was done together with our co-authors. So Jan and I sort of read the chapters that everybody did. We then coded the variables as we thought they would be coded. Then it went back to the authors, and we had long discussions about whether we were getting the coding right. So we found 5 distinct patterns, which really could argue were 4 distinct patterns, because one is exceptional. That's the case of Ukraine after comparing the 17 cases. So there were 3 different patterns by which fractured memory regimes emerged. The one insular case, the one unique case was Ukraine, and given time constraints, I will talk less about that one. Then there was a second pattern which had to do with negotiated extrication from communism, and that we see in Poland, Hungary, and Slovenia. This is why Jan talked about the importance of reformed communism. I think by the 3 countries he meant Yugoslavia. There's some other cases that had reformed communism as well, but those didn't lead to fractured regimes because of other important variables. And then the third pattern is a polarization of politics. We have here ethnization. It's not ethnization. It should be polarization because only. Push it forward. Because only. Sorry.
You don't want to tell
because
the story?
only Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia had an ethnic component, and Romania and Slovakia it was much more political, so it was more left-right. But let's go back to the Hungary, the Poland-Hungary-Slovenia pattern. Quite interesting. So, in all of these cases, we had reform-oriented communist parties which had relatively high degrees of liberalization for communist regimes. They also had, comparatively, compared to the rest of the region, very strong oppositional movements. And so when the point of extrication came from communism in 1989, in all 3 cases, there were negotiated transitions out of communism in which either formally or informally, the representatives of the party state and the opposition sat down and set the terms for extrication from communism. The reform-oriented communists as well emerged from this somewhat diminished at first, but recasting themselves as newly born democratic social democrats. And this made them viable in the short term. By 1993, most of these parties were once again viable and led to the emergence of a new kind of cleavage structure, which was post-communist versus post-opposition in post-communist politics. And as a result of this, there was a strong political cleavage, which we call left-right. You might disagree with that, but we'll say it's a strong left-right cleavage. At the time of the commemoration of 1989, this created an interesting opportunity, particularly for those parties on the political right coming from the oppositional camp. Because of the nature of the transition being negotiated, certain members of the opposition are implicated in the deal of extraction from communism. Certain other members of the opposition side were not party to that deal. Usually what happened is that the more moderate members of the opposition were caught up in the negotiation strategy, whereas more radical members were kept out of that deal, and they often led to rather different parties after the extrication from communism. So quite often there's a political actor that emerges as a memory warrior that attacks the extrication deal, describes it as rotten, unfinished, corrupt, or stolen revolution, the idea of imperfect democracy. And most of these parties were more nationalist, more conservative, and they actually created a highly effective platform to justify their claims for power and to attack their competitors. These actors are well known. They are Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary, and the Slovenian Democratic Party as well. And these emerged as powerful warriors in all three commemorations of 1989. The second pattern of polarized politics we see here in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Romania, and Slovakia. In these five countries, there was no strong tradition of reform under communism, and the extraction actually came in all three cases by regime collapse. So hardline regimes could not make reforms. All these countries were rather late in the process, and the regimes collapsed following the first wave of extrications. Under such conditions, when there was at least one strong polarizing cleavage at the time of commemoration, either ideological left-right or sociocultural, that is ethnic, religious, or linguistic, a memory warrior emerged. So in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, there was both an ethnic cleavage between Russians and the indigenous peoples of each country, and in some cases that was overlaid with a distributional cleavage as well, which sometimes was purely Slavic versus Balt, and other times there was actually distributional disputes within the Baltic communities in each country as well, in terms of winners and losers in the wake of free market reform. In Romania, this was the celebration coincided with the elections for the Romanian presidency and the struggle for power between the camps led by Băsescu and Ponta. And basically they began to dispute that the other one had the right to talk in the name of the Romanian Revolution. As we know, Băsescu started out in the PDS, moved a part of that party to the right, became a successful political entrepreneur, the old PD, and began to address questions of, raise questions of the past as a successful strategy. The other elements of the PDS then decided to join up with the liberals and the peasants and to attack Băsescu, both making claims that neither one had the moral legitimacy to speak in the name of the Romanian Revolution of 1989. And when this occurred, the Ponta camp then created this alliance for Timișoara, which was then immediately torpedoed by actual veterans of the Timișoara Revolution themselves, who said that he had no legitimacy to speak for them. This became a kind of a memory war in the midst of electoral campaign. In Slovakia, of course, there was also a lot of hotly contested rhetoric about the commemoration. A lot of this came from the central right liberal camp in Slovak politics, who attacked Smer and the leader Fico as being someone who was unqualified to lead the commemoration of 1989. Fico made things worse by leaving the country and spending the first part of the commemoration in London, the second part in Moscow. And then this was all complicated by the nationalists in Slovakia, who argued that we shouldn't be celebrating the gentle revolution, but what we should be doing is celebrating the separation of Slovakia from the Czech Republic. So here we had kind of three-sided memory warfare with three warriors on the field, literally at odds with each other. So it talks about the importance of kind of overlaying of other important cleavages at the time of commemoration. We can now move on to the non-fractured memory regimes, and here we see two radically different patterns. The first is a pattern of deliberate abnegation. And there is, in this case, a unified field, but not an enforced unified field in the way Jan kind of talked about communist era. But this was a unified field in that nobody decided to treat memory politics as a salient political issue on which they could gain any ground. So the abnegation was deliberate. People literally did not go there. So this only appears in the former Yugoslav republics of Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. These were all parts of Yugoslavia with its unique form of reformed communism. But for the Yugoslavs, 1989 does not evoke the fall of the Berlin Wall, it probably evokes more than anything else Milosevic's speech in the Field of Blackbirds in 1989, and how that began the deterioration of Yugoslavia and its descent into civil war. Not only is 1989 still a powerful and painful memory for most of the inhabitants of the former Yugoslavia, it is layered over with earlier conflict. So we see in many cases that people not only talk about what transpired in 1989, but they also talk about what happened in World War II and its aftermath. So in this case, the memory layering reinforces the unwillingness to talk about 1989, because you don't only talk about who killed who in your family, but you also talked about who in your family killed somebody's grandfather or grandmother. The strength of this cleavage was such that it displaced any kind of serious reexamination of the events of 1989. So what we see here is what we call a displacing memory layer in some sense. So rather than reconsider the painful and disputatious recent past, all political actors of consequence in these 5 parties became abnegators when it came to the anniversary. Nobody tried to make a political issue out of the anniversary. The unified memory regime with regard to 1989 in these cases was one where all the political actors said, let's not go there. As a result, the commemorations in the former Yugoslavia that we saw were sponsored by outside actors. They were either sponsored by the EU or by the German political foundations. They were not particularly contentious, they were not well attended, and they were met on balance with apathy, irony, or both, by both the elite and the populations of these countries. The best example, or one of the funniest things that we came across while writing the book, was the planned celebration in Beograd, where a German foundation paid a local artist to create a small cardboard model wall of the Berlin Wall to run down the middle of Belgrade. And this artist constructed this wall, and several days before the planned unveiling of it, there was a strong wind which blew it away. And we thought this was very emblematic of what happened in the Yugoslav cases. The other cases where we see, depoliticization, is where we see no memory war, is where we see depoliticization. We see this in Bulgaria, Germany, and the Czech Republic, which Jan talked about a little bit. The Czech case is the only case where we see something that's pillarized. We see Bulgaria and Germany, at least at the official level, as unified. Remember, when we're talking about the official level, we're not talking about all levels of society and acting as though there is vast agreement. We're talking about the political elite and the political sphere and the dialogue that's carried out and the posing of narratives at that level. So none of these cases, again, were reformist in their orientation under communism. And most of them, none of them really were negotiated out either. Again, in these cases, it was mostly collapse, though the East German case is a little bit more hybrid. They all shared a depoliticized field of memory politics at the time of commemoration, and thus there were no salient issues for memory warriors to play on at the time of commemoration. There were no left-right cleavages, there were no socio-cultural cleavages at that time, and in all 3 there's kind of a consensus officially about the meaning of 1989. In Bulgaria, this was a strange case. There's a brilliant paper in the book by Ganev on the valorization of nostalgia. Bulgaria is the one case where there seems to be broad nostalgia for state socialism as something that people regretted to lose. It's the only country where we detected this, at least in a widespread kind of universal sense, and it had powerful consequences for the way the anniversary of state socialism was celebrated. It wasn't marked in a powerful way, and there was kind of a lot of evocation of the past and what was lost as well in the political press. In the Czech Republic, despite those protests that Jan showed, there was relatively broad and shared memory of 1989 and the Velvet Revolution as being something positive. In the chapter by Connor O'Dwyer, he talks about 3 different sets of memory actors. The official political class, which Jan already talked about, which really downplayed the celebration. There were official celebrations, but they were not large events, and none of the political parties tried to make political hay out of them. Even the fairly hardline post-communists in the Czech Republic acknowledged that 1989 was a good thing, but only expressed some skepticism. The strongest protest, of course, came from the student movements, but that was only in the level of civil society, and as Jan described it, it was highly anti-political. It was ironic. And thus the civil and the political sphere, despite this difference of opinion, remained uncoupled. So what happened in the civil sphere did not drive the parties into political action. And for this reason, we talk about the Czechs somehow all getting along, despite there being different approaches to the anniversary, and thus we think of it as the only pillarized case that we saw emerge.
You're not talking about Germany?
Oh, in Germany, of course, sorry. My apologies. I probably didn't talk about Germany because there's so many Germans in the room, and I'm afraid of making a fool of myself. The German case, which was done by David Art, basically made the argument that the culture of contrition in Germany was kind of an overwhelming constraint on the commemoration becoming politicized by any of the political parties. Of course, November is a very loaded memnonic month for the Germans. The falling of the wall coincides with the date of Reichskristallnacht, and November is also, of course, the time when the Kaiserreich came to an end and a republic was declared. So November is chock full of all kinds of memnonic meaning for the Germans, to put it mildly. David's argument was that the potential danger that's always raised about German unification is that it could somehow turn from something that was about democracy and national reunification into something that was nationalist. And so even at the beginning of unification, these were questions that were raised by people in France and England, the United States, Russia as well. We found that there was very little of this that leaked into the commemoration of 1989 in Germany. In fact, it was celebrated in a kind of broad civic sense, a reaffirmation of freedom and national unity, symbolized by this huge symbolic demonstration and the toppling of dominoes in Berlin as the crowning event to mark the end of the wall. So in some sense, the argument in the book is that the culture of contrition, which has been so successful in Germany in many ways, and sort of coming to terms with the past and also allowing Germany to assume a leading role as a power in Europe, put strong constraints on how anybody could use unification as a political issue, and thus the celebration remained depoliticized. And thus there was a unified political culture there as well. Now to our conclusions. Our theory puts a great deal of explanatory leverage on one of the concepts that we have framed, which is the idea of the memnonic warrior. It's a memnonic warrior calling.
Which one?
I don't know. We'll find out how it fractures when we know which one it is. So our theory has quite a bit of agency in it. But as you'll see, our theory is not purely a theory of agency and voluntarism, but makes the argument that there are elements of the cultural field and the political field that constrain the way in which political actors can practice memory politics. However, when an actor can choose a memnonic warrior strategy in an effective way, it has a powerful impact on how politics in a country develops. and it has a particularly important impact on political cleavages and polarizing them. It raises the stakes of politics. It's kind of a dangerous political game. And while the patterning of actors we see across the cases, so the mix of actors are consistent with the theory of memory regimes we have, we see that the causal patterns that produce them are not uniform. That is, there are 4 or 5 patterns here, 3 which lead to fractured memory regimes, and 2 that lead to non-fractured memory regimes. So in terms of the causal patterning, the kind of structural constraints that the actors face clearly have an impact in determining the outcome. It also is important that the theory is equifinial. That is, there's no one-size-fits-all theory that explains the emergence of a memory regime, that the structural aspects affect the outcomes as well. And we would expect, for instance, if one was to do similar kinds of studies across a different set of cases, one indeed might find that other kinds of structural factors are very important in leading to the outcomes. If we take the example of the Polish, Hungarian, Slovenian path, we see that the extrication from reform state socialism via negotiation creates new opportunities for a particular set of political actors. And it allows them to enter the field as a memory warrior in a way that's very effective at times. But this is merely one way to the result. The memory warriors in Romania or in the Baltic states were somewhat different. This means that elite choice concerning the manner of engagement in mnemonic politics has an important effect on the stakes and tenor of the political game. That is to say, elites make conscious choices that can have kind of causal impact and can strongly affect the quality of democracy. This doesn't mean that there's any inevitable outcome from the choosing of a particular strategy, but it also, and this is important because it means that when actors consciously choose to engage in mnemonic war, they're entering into a more kind of dangerous game of politics. This doesn't doom anybody's politics, though. We know from the study of the interwar period, particularly if we look at the work of a political scientist like Giovanni Capoccia, he selected several cases in Europe that had very similar structural conditions to Weimar Germany and showed how all these countries avoided the breakdown of democracy. And this had to do with choices that political actors made at key junctures. They too faced economic crisis. They too faced powerful anti-system parties of the right and the left, as they did in Weimar. They also faced polities that were polarizing, but actors took action which, in some sense, made the structural conditions not inevitable outcomes. So our theory also points to the idea that there is this interplay between structure and actors, and this is essential in moving outcomes forward. Thanks. We close the book by reflecting on what memory war means for democracy, and particularly for new democracies. And we believe democracy as a system at minimum requires those who are engaged in political competition to not try to change outcomes ex ante or ex post. That is, democracy is a system of political uncertainty. That is, you should not know the outcome of democracy before the fact, and once democratic decision-making has taken place, you should not try and change it after the fact. If you try and do that, you are threatening democracy and you're reducing the quality of democracy in your country by trying to change things ex ante or ex post. We believe that mnemonic warriors is one of the most effective strategies of biasing democratic outcomes ex ante, and we believe it's a kind of dangerous strategy. Specifically, what memory war does is try to delegitimize your opponents in politics. It argues that what they believe makes them unsuitable to hold power. It turns politics into a zero-sum game that promotes polarization. It treats the loss of power to someone who does not agree to you as a catastrophe. democracy is procedural, and this in some sense elevates substance over procedure. We would argue that democracy has to accommodate substance within a particular set of procedures, otherwise you no longer have democracy. So the strategy of memory war, by trying to disqualify opponents ex ante, is geared to making short-term gains in power at the expense of the quality of democracy. And the one case that we have in the book that shows, we think, how particularly dangerous this is Hungary. That is, Hungary shows that when such restraint disappears, when one treats one's opponents as though they are not fit to hold power, as they're barely human, as they're tainted, democracy can take on a strongly majoritarian character. And when that majoritarian character gets strained, if not checked, it has the potential of evolving in an authoritarian direction, as we're seeing in Hungary today. Thank you.
Thank you very much both for your very interesting speeches, very rich in comparative, methodological, historical and genetical contents. So discussion is following, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Tito from University of Louvain. So your model is very convincing and it has a lot of heuristic power. My question is mostly methodological. How much commemoration of this single event can be representative of the situation in the whole country? For instance, I saw that Croatia is then put in the second group of deliberate abnegation of memory. Well, if we analyze the commemoration, perhaps yes, but what happened last year when one ex-communist politician was extradited to Germany, it was a situation almost of constitutional crisis. And there's endless talks about unfinished lustration, doing lustration again, which is again much different than Bosnia or Serbia. So my question is basically this methodological. Or was it possible to take a broader focus on the social situation? Thank you.
Should we answer or take more?
As you prefer, though maybe...
Why don't we go one at a time? I think we have time. So. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so...
You go first, and if I feel like adding something, I will.
This is a very good question because it takes us to the center of something that we've struggled with a lot, and then the struggle is still going on, right? This is, and here's the set of problems that are in your question. First, as I said at the beginning, we call for the approach to the national memory, or field of national memory, that calls for going back to the drawing board, just scratch everything we know in the most radical way, what we've written so far about national memories, and start all over again, one regime at a time, one memory regime at a time. Take an event and see what happens, like we did with the case of the fall of communism in 1989. You're absolutely right. You look at another memory regime, even the memory of communism itself, not just the fall, and it will play differently. You know, this is very limited approach in the sense, but it is the approach that tries to be, inductively systematic. You know, there is too much synthetic thinking, which is very flaky about, in our view, in my view at least, in the field of memory studies. So it takes a lot of work, just regime by regime, and then we'll figure out how to put it all together. And the result it can be easily falsified. You know, we are both Popperians. We would love to, someone falsifies, fine, it's a move forward. I am not attached to the particular result. I'm attached to developing a procedure of finding out how it actually works, because honestly, we know very little about all of this.
Let me throw something in here too. We did cross-sectional variation. There's no reason why you couldn't use this method of studying memory regimes longitudinally and then talk about development through time of one country and how its official political culture changes over time by using the study of memory regimes longitudinally. It's simply our form of inference was cross-sectional. We focused on one crucial event, which is the commemoration of 1989 or 1981, a monumental historical event for the history of Europeans, and looked across 17 cases. But there's no reason why this couldn't be done longitudinally, precisely in the way you talked about, to talk about change in official political culture, for instance.
Now, two more things, if I can say, because this is really the question takes us to the essence of a lot of things. One thing is that, as I said at the beginning, we're trying to stay atop, of the theorizing that tells us that we need to take seriously a very complex relationship between agency and structure. Now, I believe that if you take agency seriously, you are saying, I cannot predict the future. Because an agent can suddenly, even if we know a lot about structure and structure of narratives and those things, as was in the previous session, the question about Germany, right? There was dramatic discontinuity constructed in a very complex way. So, for example, if, looking now at the celebrations of 25th anniversary, first of all, I didn't have time to really look at them, but I was in Poland in June, and I observed the celebrations on the 25th anniversary. They were completely different than on the 20th anniversary. Right? They were very unified. Obama was here. Maybe that was the reason, that he kind of worked as a unifier, so additional actor. But peace in the Kaczynski, if those of you who know, he basically abnegated. This time, peace abnegated. Kaczynski was not participating in the celebrations. He called sick. Like your students before the exam, they suddenly get sick. Kaczynski got sick and didn't show up for anything related to the 25th anniversary. It's a classical maneuver of an abnegator. So Kaczynski changed strategy in 5 years from warrior to abnegator, and that changes the game. Right? So that's why it's impossible to predict, although they choose within the certain range, which is in this case determined by our analytical scheme. And final thing, we don't have time to talk about it. I'm an anthropologist, so this part was a little bit on me, was to try to figure out what is the relationship between the cultural layer of those ceremonies and something that is called national culture. Now, national culture we define in a very broad way, somehow actually influenced by Polish cultural sociology, going back to Kłoskowska, I suppose, as a field of discourses that for one reason or another we have no time to discuss, exist in a given social-political space. The articulation between the memory regimes, case by case, and those fields are very interesting and sometimes predictable. To put it very simply, just to give you two examples, in the Polish case, you can easily interpret this whole war as a very powerful paradigm of Polish national culture, romantics versus positivists. And PO is more positivist, peace is more romantic, and those of you who do not know what I'm talking about, then let's do it over a glass of wine, and those of you who know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And then at the Czech case, which I always have audacity to talk about because my grandmother was Czech, is that, I went into the literature on the Czech culture, political culture. I know my Hašek very well, and Good Soldier Švejk is one of my cultural heroes. But I went to, whatever has been written about the Czech culture, and many Czech anthropologists, including Ladislav Holý, who is perhaps the most known, but others write about this feature of the Czech culture. Right? The tanks come toward Prague, and we go into a beer cellar, and we drink our beer until the tanks pass. Then we emerge, and we resume our life. It is unthinkable in the Polish culture, right? You have to be on the barricade and die, basically. Or if you're a positivist, you will not be on the barricade, but you're maybe not drinking beer, but vodka somewhere else and waiting. But whatever. Those are the power of narratives that were discussed in the first keynote. And there is something there, but again, within the certain range, you can move, right? So you can move from being romantic in a given memory regime to being a positivist in another memory regime. And that makes it almost impossible to determine sort of in a more kind of a priori way or more deductive way. That's why we think it needs to be done inductively.
It's very interesting. I just add, if you look at the Slovak case, you'll find Kevin Deegan-Krause writes a very interesting chapter with Sharon Volchik and Illinois, Carol Leff. The three of them came together to write this very interesting chapter where you have the three actors being the center-right liberals, Smer, and the nationalists. And depending on the anniversary, they change positions. So, you know, on the Slovak uprising, Smer is very strongly pro, whereas the nationalists are very anti, and the center right is kind of more abnegating. If you talk about Tiso, then all of a sudden the nationalists get very supportive, and Smer becomes very much a memory warrior, saying, you know, how could you recollect Tiso and so forth. And you see this kind of literally within a year over the course of the calendar, on the basis of different anniversaries, different people moving to positions of memnonic abnegation, warrior status, or being a pluralist.
So now we collected 2, 3, 4 questions.
Two short questions. One is concerning this methodology of intuitive choice of the indicators. So my question is, what kind of indicators you resign to use? So not what kind of indicator? What? You resign to use. So you found useless or not so important. Another question is about Germany, because I have some problems with thinking about celebration of the 1989 case of Germany. Did you compare the federal anniversary with the provincial? So the distinctions between the West and East in Germany.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. I have two questions, short ones. If you could explain the notion of memory layering, which you mentioned, but then you didn't develop, and I would like to hear more about it, if possible. And the other question is, did you think about extending your model to other post-authoritarian countries, not necessarily post-communist? Thank you.
And also a question about the case of Ukraine in terms of your approach.
Mm-hmm. Oh, another one.
Thank you very much for a fascinating session. Could you say anything about how this latest research that you have conducted has shed light on the role of memory institutions, official memory institutions, on shaping collective memory? Was there anything interesting new that came out?
Okay. Memory institutions.
Please.
Well, we have 5 questions, so I will abnegate them for.
Well, we can start by answering the provincial question. No, we looked at the national celebrations, and we're working with the case material that was prepared for us by David Art, and then analyzing that. I know, for instance, there were other kinds of celebrations in places like Leipzig, but for instance, we didn't bring those in. What variables did we kick out? Do you remember? I would also say that it wasn't completely intuitional. I would say that it also, we had 15 pretty good brains around the table, and we talked about this. So it wasn't just Jan and I pulling them out of the air. We did an initial conference where people presented the case material, and then we talked about what to do with it afterwards. And they had already worked off of our initial theoretical chapter and a model case chapter that we had done on Poland, and then they tried to kind of extend the method to other places. And then we talked with them about kind of what was causal in their cases in our wrap-up, and then brought that in before we wrote the conclusion and did the Boolean analysis. But I'm trying to think if we threw anything out.
Yeah, I remember too.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember the set. We were thinking about economic factors, and broadly understood, even we were thinking about and social cleavages. the second group. Social group, social structure. We actually spent some time talking about it. And then, something that was very close to being included in the moment was changing definitions by ex-communists, because that over 20 years they changed. So we started, who are ex-communists, as we call it, at the time of extrication? Then who are the communists or ex-communists at the time of celebration? And then we realized that this is misleading because they may be social democrats in '89 and social democrats in 2009, but if you follow it, particularly in Romania, then in the meantime they may have been nationalists. So we just went, I think, for the time of celebration. Actually, the slide is this old slide which says time of extrication. And that's we left because it was out of desperation. We started coding, and this is in itself a story that the ex-communists, that all the parties in Eastern Europe, as you know, are constantly changing the identity. Not constantly, but few of them, and they change. Memory layering. I don't think we have a strict definition, which perhaps should be fixed in next time, in the next edition or something like that. It is still left at the level of intuition, but there is as there are situations, and I don't know how to code it numerically, for example, right? But there is a certain scale of intensity where another event encroaches on the event you're analyzing in such a way that it clearly interferes with the interpretation of the analyzed event's meaning. And that was absolutely, for me, as I said, it was absolutely overwhelming in the case of Hungary, when 1956 was totally changing. It was invoked. One way of doing that is you go to the explicit statements of the actors at the time of the celebration and you see what they're saying, right? And you code on their statements, some kind of content analysis. And in 1956 was constantly invoked. Do you remember any other example?
Well, let me give you a beautiful example because it also doesn't have a single causal direction. So, for instance, in the Baltic cases, the commemorations are kind of bracketed. Green? In the Baltic cases, in some sense, the memory layering works to intensify the cleavages, because 1989 and 1991 are kind of bracketed by anniversaries of Molotov-Ribbentrop and the actual annexation of the Baltic states. So this actually intensifies the memory politics in the Baltics. The examples we gave you of the 5 Yugoslav cases, it was the pain of the past and reopening that and what it would mean in terms of moving from post-conflict settlement into renewed conflict that kept people from appealing to that in politics. But it's the question of another kind of memory that is, for some reason, gets associated with another set of memories and kind of impinges upon the way in which it is celebrated or recollected, and somehow the two merge in consciousness and affect how the other one is interpreted. And there seemed to be a lot of that in the region. Clearly it's there in the German case as well.
So there are 3 more questions left very quickly. Other post-authoritarian countries, you ask. Well, as I said at the beginning, this would have to be modified somehow, and we are not sure how, if you would be dealing with settings that are not democratic. Because what our model assumes that the actor can enter the field of memory politics somewhat unconstrained, that they can say whatever they want. So Russia immediately was out because there was, it was such an uneven sort of contest. Not that it is totally silent, but you go to Central Asia, it's totally silent. There's and they're very guarding very carefully the authorities eliminating alternative voices. Ukraine is a separate case because that method basically the Boolean method sounds kind of very scientific, but it's in a way very simple. You know, you can do it manually, but the computer, it groups cases when you have similar values on the given variable. And then it creates clusters. So that's why out of 17 we end up with 5, and one of the clusters has, as a set, has only one member, which is Ukraine, because nothing reduced. So Ukraine has completely, we could go back if you want to the slide, it is, you have to tell, here when you tell the stories of other countries, you can tell them in a simplified version, because the analysis showed you where the simplifications are possible. Ukraine is just one complex story, which is kind of interesting in its case because it is the least democratic of all the cases and perhaps the most complex, for the reasons that, you know, tragically we're observing. You know, the book went into print when Putin decided to make the whole situation way more interesting, right? So this is, we can maybe talk about it later if you're interested. We can show you that. And very quickly, national memory institutions, it's a very easy answer. We didn't touch it.
Let me just add a couple of things. If I think moving about this to other post-authoritarian countries, I think the broad framework in terms of memory actors and memory regimes could be, let's say, transplanted and used to analyze other regions. But the structural factors we identified for post-communism would have to be completely re-examined in a radically different context. So, for instance, if you wanted to look at this, looking at, I don't know, South American post-authoritarianism, you'd have to take into account different kinds of structural factors and constraints, I think. But I think perhaps the conceptual part having to do with memory regimes and types of memory actors might be transferable to different contexts, but I would be very hesitant to move any of the causal variables that were specific to the post-communist context to others. You know, there were certain ways in which national memory institutions did come into some of the casework. For instance, it did come into the Polish case because there were several books that came out and reinforced the narrative of a betrayed revolution that were sponsored by the National Institute here, for instance. And so, quite clearly, national memory institutions play an important role in setting the national memory field, in helping to guide and produce things like textbooks and school books and the creation of culture, and even at times authors who write controversial works or historians who write controversial works can really have an impact on the memory field. So, you know, the books that were accused Wałęsa of being a spy really played into that narrative of the betrayed revolution quite clearly.
So, thank you very much. We are kindly but firmly requested to stop the discussion and take a cup of coffee.